Hey there, deep diver. Today we're going deep, all right? Going deep into ancient skepticism.
Oh, yeah. Sounds fun.
It is, and you sent over some excerpts from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
Ah, yes.
Yeah, and we're really excited to kind of unpack all that with you. And I know you're a philosopher,
I am.
so we're gonna kind of skip the intro stuff and really dive right into some of the good stuff, the nuances and the debates and all that.
Excellent. I'm excited for that.
Yeah,
Yeah, so we're talking about ancient Greece, specifically the Hellenistic period. And skepticism back then wasn't just about, doubting things. It was
right,
a way of thinking about, knowledge, belief, and even how to live a good life.
right. So the philosophy.
A philosophy, exactly.
Okay. All right. So let's kind of set the stage here a little bit. Skepticism back then wasn't just, some isolated idea. The Stanford Encyclopedia mentions that it existed alongside these other big schools of thought, like, the Stoics and the Epicureans.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, what was that landscape like? I mean, what was going on back then?
It was such a vibrant time. You can kind of imagine a bustling marketplace, but of ideas.
Ooh, I like that.
You've got the Stoics who were all about virtue and reason,
Okay.
and then you've got the Epicureans who were more focused on pleasure and avoiding pain.
Okay.
And right in the mix, you've got these skeptics questioning everything. So there are all these lively debates, challenging assumptions, really pushing those philosophical boundaries.
Oh, wow, that's so cool. It's like a battle of the minds going on.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So how did the skeptics approach knowledge differently from, say, like the Stoics or the Epicureans?
Well, a lot of philosophies during this time were all about the pursuit of knowledge.
Yeah.
But the ancient skeptics, they kind of took a different route. They were more interested in the nature of the belief.
Belief. Okay.
Yeah, and they actually they use this Greek term doxa for belief. And doxa, it connects to this idea of seeming or appearing.
Hold on. Belief versus knowledge.
Yeah,
For someone like me who loves epistemology, I geek out on this stuff.
right.
That's a really fascinating distinction.
It is.
Why did they focus on belief?
Well, think about, all the things that you believe.
Yeah.
Have you ever stopped and asked yourself why you believe those things?
Hmm.
What makes those beliefs justified?
Well, yeah.
And that's what really consumed those ancient skeptics. They were so concerned with how beliefs are formed, especially when we don't have, a clear-cut criterion of truth.
Right. So instead of like seeking certainty, they were kind of diving deep into the very foundation of our beliefs,
That's it.
how they arise and what justifies them. That's pretty heady stuff.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But if they were constantly questioning their beliefs, wouldn't that make it kind of impossible to actually do anything?
Right.
Like we need beliefs, don't we, to guide our actions?
Exactly. And that gets to the heart of what's called the apraxia charge.
The what charge?
Apraxia charge. And this is the argument that, skeptics would be paralyzed by indecision.
Oh, okay.
Right. So how could you choose what to eat
Yeah.
if you doubted everything about food?
Right.
Right. But the skeptics actually had some pretty clever counter arguments to this.
Okay.
Okay.
I'm hooked. How did they get around that? I mean, that seems like a real paradox.
Yeah, they relied on a couple of key concepts, the plausible and appearances.
Okay.
And these provided enough guidance, they thought, to navigate daily life without needing that absolute certainty.
Okay.
So think about it. Have you ever, just gone with your gut feeling,
Yeah.
even if you weren't 100% certain?
All the time.
Right. So they weren't completely frozen by doubt.
Right.
They just had a different, more nuanced way of approaching choices.
Right. So they weren't just, sitting there paralyzed, unable to move or do anything.
Exactly.
They just had a different way of kind of approaching how they made decisions.
Exactly. Now, to really understand how they put this into practice, I think we need to introduce you to some of the big names in ancient skepticism.
Ooh, okay.
Think Pyrrho, Anicedemus, Sextus Empiricus,
So like the rock stars of doubt.
the rock stars of doubt. I love it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, let's start with Pyrrho. I've heard that he was known for being just incredibly tranquil, like almost unfazed by anything. Is that true?
He was the epitome of chill. Pyrrho, unfortunately, he didn't write anything down himself,
Okay.
which kind of adds to the mystique.
Right.
But his student, Timon, described him as seeing everything as equally indifferent, unstable and indeterminate.
Wow.
And this led him to a state of ataraxia.
Ataraxia.
Yeah.
Okay.
Fancy Greek term for what we might call serenity or peace of mind.
Wow. So he really achieved like a level of zen that most of us can only dream of.
That's right.
Yeah. But how did he actually get there? I mean, was there like a specific method to his tranquility?
Yeah, so his approach really emphasized suspending judgment.
To spending judgment. Okay.
He didn't try to determine whether something was like definitively true or false.
Right.
Instead of he just kind of embraced the uncertainty. He adopted this no more this than that stance.
Oh, no more this than that. Okay. So instead of like getting caught up in like proving one side or the other, he just acknowledged the ambiguity and moved on.
Exactly.
That's a really powerful approach, especially in a world where it feels like everyone always demands, definitive answers.
Yeah.
All right. So now you mentioned Anicedemus earlier.
Yes.
What was his contribution to ancient skepticism?
So Anicedemus, he developed these really brilliant argumentative strategies called the 10 modes.
The 10 modes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And these were designed to demonstrate how any claim could be countered, ultimately leading to that suspension of judgment.
Okay, so 10 modes. It's like a philosophical toolkit for dismantling dogma.
I like that, yeah.
Yeah. So what were some of these modes and how did they actually work?
Yeah, they were really tools for shaking up rigid thinking and exposing the limits of our knowledge.
Okay.
So take, for example, the mode of disagreement.
Mode of disagreement. Okay.
And this one points out how people's perceptions and judgments differ based on all sorts of factors, like personal experiences, cultural backgrounds, even, simple things like taste preferences.
Like how some people just can't sense cilantro,
Yes.
while other people, think it's delicious.
Exactly, yeah. So if something as basic as taste can be so subjective, what does that tell us about, the idea of objective truth?
Right. Right. That's a really good point. It makes you wonder, if anything can be definitively labeled as good or bad if our perspectives just vary so widely.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Okay, so what other mind-bending modes did Anicedemus come up with?
Another really fascinating one is the mode of circumstances.
Mode of circumstances. Okay.
And this one argues that our perceptions are constantly being influenced by external factors like our environment, our emotional state, even the time of day.
Oh, I can totally relate to that. A glass of wine after a long day can feel like a reward. But, it might not be so appealing first thing in the morning. Context is everything.
Exactly. And the principle, it extends beyond just, sensory experiences. Our beliefs about morality, politics, philosophy, you name it, they're all shaped by those circumstances in which we encounter them.
Yeah, so it's not just about like physical sensations. It's really about how our entire worldview is shaped by our unique experiences.
Right.
Yeah. It kind of reminds me of Protagoras' famous statement, man is the measure of all things.
Yes.
Did the skeptics, did they kind of connect their ideas to that line of thinking at all?
It's a natural comparison.
Yeah.
But there's a subtle difference.
Okay.
While Protagoras seemed to embrace a kind of relativism,
Okay.
where every individual's perspective is equally valid,
Right.
the skeptics were a little bit more cautious.
Okay.
They didn't necessarily claim that, everything is relative.
Okay.
They just highlighted the difficulty of establishing, those truly objective standards.
Okay. So they were less about proclaiming, definitive truths and more about questioning assumptions.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Okay. So were all 10 modes focused on subjective experience, or did they kind of explore other avenues of doubt?
Oh, they had plenty of other tricks up their sleeves.
Okay.
One that really gets you thinking is the mode of quantities.
Quantities. Okay.
And this one points out how our perceptions can shift dramatically based on changes in, quantity or degree.
Okay, you've got my attention. Give me an example.
Okay. Imagine holding a single grain of sand.
Okay.
Does it feel heavy?
No, not at all. It's practically weightless.
But what if you were carrying like a whole bucket of sand?
Okay.
Suddenly the weight becomes very noticeable, right?
Yeah, for sure.
So is sand inherently heavy or light?
Well, it seems like it's both, depending on the quantity. Huh. I never thought about it that way.
Right. So the skeptics use this kind of reasoning to demonstrate the ambiguity of these seemingly straightforward concepts.
Right.
So if something can appear both heavy and light, depending on the context, what other categories that we take for granted might be equally slippery.
Yeah, you know what? I'm starting to really see the appeal of this skeptical approach. It's like a mental exercise in challenging all those ingrained categories that we use to understand the world. I mean, this is making me question everything I thought I knew.
That's the power of it.
Yeah. Okay. So all this talk of questioning assumptions, it kind of brings us back to Sextus Empiricus, who we were discussing earlier.
Yes.
You'll recall that there's this whole debate surrounding him. Was he truly a radical skeptic who believed nothing, or did he kind of sneak in some beliefs through the back door?
Right, the skeptic with a secret stash of beliefs.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. So what are the arguments for and against, Sextus being a true skeptic?
So, on the one hand, Sextus explicitly stated that the skeptic determines nothing and merely assents to appearances without necessarily believing that they reflect, ultimate reality.
Okay.
But that raises this tricky question.
Yeah.
If you assent to something,
Yeah.
doesn't that imply some level of belief?
It does seem like there's a bit of a contradiction there.
Right,
If you're acting as if you believe something,
right.
can you really claim to be a true skeptic?
That's the heart of the debate.
Yeah.
Some scholars suggest that Sextus was using language strategically,
Okay.
that he was finding a way to navigate the world
Right.
without fully endorsing any specific beliefs.
So he was speaking the language of belief without actually buying into it completely.
That's it.
Okay. That's a subtle distinction, but an important one if we're trying to understand, his approach.
Absolutely. And it highlights the importance of language for the skeptics,
Okay.
right? They had to find ways to articulate their ideas without falling into the trap of dogma themselves.
Right.
They were walking this philosophical tightrope.
Yeah. Wow. I'm starting to realize just how nuanced ancient skepticism really was. Um, it wasn't just about blanket doubt.
No.
It was about carefully navigating uncertainty
Yes.
and using language in a way that reflected that.
Exactly.
Now, you mentioned something earlier about Sextus's unique way of talking about appearances.
Yes.
Could you expand on that a bit more?
Of course. So Sextus was very deliberate in distinguishing between how things appeared to him
Right.
and how they might actually be in some, objective sense.
Right.
So he'd say things like, honey appears sweet to me now,
Okay.
but he wouldn't go so far as to declare honey is sweet.
Oh, so he's acknowledging his subjective experience,
Yeah,
but without claiming to have like a God's eye view of reality.
exactly.
That's a really clever way to kind of avoid making absolute statements.
It is, but I imagine you're still wrestling with this idea of, living without beliefs.
Yeah.
How can you make decisions, plan for the future, even have a meaningful conversation if you don't believe anything?
You read my mind. Those are the questions that are kind of swirling around for me. So how did the skeptics kind of reconcile their philosophical outlook with the need to actually function in the world?
Yeah, it's a question that's, really challenged philosophers for centuries.
Right.
And the ancient skeptics, well, they had some pretty compelling answers, I think. Remember that concept of appearances
Yeah.
that we were talking about earlier?
Mm-hmm.
That played a really crucial role in their approach to action.
Right. Sextus Empiricus argued that we could rely on appearances to guide our actions without necessarily believing that those appearances were true representations of reality.
That's it. It's about navigating daily life based on what seems to be the case without, getting bogged down in that search for absolute certainty. Think about it. Do you stop to ponder, the intricacies of physics every time you flip a light switch?
Definitely not. No, I just, I trust that it'll work based on experience, not because I've personally confirmed the laws of electricity or anything.
Exactly. And Sextus recognized this kind of practical knowledge as a sufficient basis for navigating, most situations. And he called it relying on the plausible,
Okay.
what seems reasonable given the circumstances.
So it's not about like rejecting all forms of reasoning or evidence.
Right.
It's more about recognizing the limitations of our knowledge.
Yes.
And not claiming to know more than we actually do.
You got it. Ancient skepticism wasn't about detaching from the world.
Right.
It was about finding a way to live thoughtfully and peacefully within a world full of uncertainty. It's like, embracing the fog rather than pretending it doesn't exist.
That's such a great analogy, and it seems like a big part of that is letting go of the need to be right all the time.
Absolutely. Sextus really believed that, clinging to these rigid beliefs, it
Right.
was a major source of anxiety
Hmm.
and unhappiness. And by suspending judgment, he argued we could achieve that state of tranquility, that ataraxia that Pyro, kind of exemplified.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, just imagine feeling, completely calm and unbothered, no matter what life throws your way. It's a state of mind that I think a lot of us uh, strive for, especially in our modern world where it feels like everyone is just so certain of everything. But did this skeptical approach extend to ethics? Like, did they have any moral principles at all?
It's a great question, and one that sparked, a lot of debate among scholars. But Sextus argued that skeptics should live according to the customs and laws of their society.
Okay,
So they weren't, promoting anarchy
right,
or a do whatever you want kind of morality.
right. So they weren't moral relativists in the sense of saying like anything goes.
Not quite. They recognized the practical need
Sure.
for social norms,
Yeah.
conventions, but they also applied, their skeptical lens to ethical theories,
Okay.
questioning whether any single system could claim to have a monopoly on truth.
Right. So it's like saying, be a good person, follow the rules, but don't assume you have all the answers when it comes to morality.
You nailed it. And this approach extended to pretty much every area of philosophy. The skeptics questioned, the foundations of logic, physics, you name it. They were equal opportunity inquirers, always, probing deeper.
But they weren't nihilists. They weren't saying that nothing mattered or that life was meaningless.
No, no, not at all. They saw skepticism not as a rejection of life,
Right.
but as a way to live more authentically and peacefully.
Yeah.
It's about accepting that mystery, the complexity of existence, allowing ourselves to say, I don't know,
Mm-hmm.
and being okay with that.
This deep dive has been incredible. We've covered so much ground, but it feels like we've only just scratched the surface of ancient skepticism.
Well, that's the beauty of philosophy, right?
Yeah.
It's an ongoing exploration, a conversation that spans, centuries. And ancient skepticism, it offers these really valuable tools for anyone who wants to think critically, question assumptions, and navigate a world that's just overflowing with information and competing viewpoints.
It's a reminder that we don't always, need definitive answers.
Right.
Sometimes the most valuable thing is the willingness to embrace uncertainty
Yes.
and keep asking questions.
Well said. And who knows, you might even discover a little bit of that ancient ataraxia along the way.
And that's what we call a successful deep dive. Thanks for joining us on this journey into ancient skepticism. Until next time, happy pondering.